your mid-levels are, I love mid-level providers. They can see tons of that while the doctors are busy, doing a little bit more of the serious cases. But even paramedics working in the ER. Mm-hmm. I mean, they can give so many meds, do all kinds of stuff. Like, it's becoming a lot more multifaceted to where it's streamlining how everybody goes through the ERs, which is nice to see.
Depending on what the individual facilities allow and the individual state regulations are and that sort of thing. Because unfortunately, there are some places across, in different parts of the country where even paramedics have a very limited scope.
Yeah.
Especially once you cross that line from out of hospital to in hospital. When you have physicians, PAs, NPs that are available, then a lot of the institutions say, well, why do we need a paramedic to be able to give this medication? Because we have a nurse here. Because we have a PA that can do that suturing, that NP that can, order this medication. And while that's true, there is a certain amount of benefit to expanding the scope of out-of-hospital clinicians that have an understanding of how to perform certain tasks and specifically training them and credentialing them to do those tasks under the direct supervision of licensed clinicians.
Which is awesome, like on the 911 side, because there's a lot of states, and I meet, paramedics and EMTs that come here from other states, and they have a hell of a time when they come to work on the 911 ambulances because the stuff that we can do here is crazy. And they'll be like, I couldn't intubate people. I couldn't give this unless I called the doc. I couldn't. And in a lot of places, if you're an EMT, you can put oxygen on. Can't start IVs. Like, there's all kinds of meds I can give. But our doctors are very forward thinking here. And it also makes his job a lot easier because otherwise he's taking the majority of every call that now it really breaks it up. We can almost run one for one the whole shift.
One of the issues we run into in the out-of-hospital setting, though, is that there isn't really a true national standard. That I misspoke a little bit. So, yes, we have the national core curriculum that is the baseline for education for the various different levels of out-of-hospital clinician. But that's only for national registry because different states can require different things. And so the requirements to obtain a state out-of-hospital certification to work is not necessarily the same as, from one state to another versus what the national registry requires.
Right.
And so because we have a system that's not standardized, you don't know what you're getting when you go from one state to the next.
Truth. Yeah. Big time.
And to your point, yes, we do have the ability in this state, at least, to do certain things, like, so a couple of abbreviations that I'll circle back to briefly. And for those that don't know, MAM, M-A-A-M, is Medication-Assisted Airway Management, which is what we've moved away from calling RSI, because that term rapid sequence intubation has created an unfortunate effect of moving too quickly, and like we talked about earlier, those patients can potentially decompensate and actually arrest in the peri-intubation period. And I'm sure that we've all seen that at least a couple of times for a patient that's not been effectively resuscitated before they've been intubated. And in that case, we move on to, at least in our organization, M&E, that Casey mentioned earlier, which is mentoring and education. We prefer to use that term as opposed to morbidity and mortality, because that has at least in the history of the House of Medicine, has the stigma. Thank you.
You're welcome.
For you've done something wrong, and
Yeah.
we're going to shake our fingers at you, and we're going to put you on display, and we're going to make an example of you.
Yeah.
And that's not the goal, right?
And I've actually been through a couple of those. And I was walking in like, oh, am I toast?
I'm a
Like, they are
routine.
gonna
I'm a
nitpick
routine
me.
member. actually.
And it wasn't at all. It was great.
Yeah.
But so we have this varied scope across the country. And we're, yes, able to do things here that in other states aren't necessarily allowable acts or have much more regulation. But at the same time, we have a lot of restrictions on what we're able to do that are a lot easier to accomplish in other states. Because the way that our state EMS Allowable Acts law is set up, it is set as the ceiling. And you cannot exceed that ceiling except for some very certain specific nuanced things that take, years to get through. As opposed to other states where it's more of a I don't want to say delegated practice because that's very specific to one state, but it's more medical directors are more free to allow certain things. And so when we talk about something like medication-assisted intubation, there are certain regions where they do not paralyze in the field. They won't sedate, they won't paralyze. They will maybe use a little bit of sedation, but in the patient that is already almost unresponsive, just to facilitate passage of that tube. But unfortunately, when you don't have a good national standard for what you expect from state to state to state, that creates deficiencies in training, and that creates difficulty in moving from one state to another. And then our out-of-hospital clinicians have, let's say, catching up to do if they make that shift, or they find themselves stuck, so to speak, in an area where they understand the protocols, know their guidelines, and feel comfortable functioning in such an environment. And then we run into the issues of what do we do in the more rural settings where we have difficulty retaining, not just retaining, but training the clinicians to the appropriate level.
Well, it's really difficult there because they don't get the repetition, like you do in a city this size. Where,
Absolutely.
Where you may get a tube every few months, or every month even, or you may get, any number of procedures, finger thoracostomy, whatever. Getting that out in the rural setting it's so few and far between that people can't get good at it because they don't have the repetition. So it's really difficult training wise. I think our trainings have become more realistic in that we can actually, do those things on a fairly regular basis with the people in the rural setting, paramedics especially. That is getting better, but there is that issue, and there's also an issue of having a paramedic glut too, where you have way too many paramedics on too few apparatus. Where there are some operations, not here, but there's some places where everybody on the fire department's a paramedic, and those guys don't want to be paramedics necessarily. You may have a guy that's a driver paramedic who he wants to be a driver. Those guys that run trucks, they're artists with that ladder. It takes practice. It takes intellect. It takes, knowing that job specifically.
If you're going to properly block a driveway,
yes.
you need to know where to park that thing to make it impossible to get the cot up the driveway.
That's fact. But I mean, but what I'm saying is that, there's a lot of places that they have way too many paramedics. And so you don't get the same thing that you get when you're in a rural area.
The skill decay is very real.
Yep. You don't get enough. You don't get enough repetition in getting a tube. Who's going to get the tube? The senior medic on that apparatus is going to get that tube. It's his bus. It's his truck. Whatever. And so.
But at the same time, some situations like that, it's I would argue the responsibility of that senior medic to recognize I've done this more than my counterparts. And
now it's your turn.
Now it's your turn.
Yeah.
And my role in that is no longer doing the procedure. My role in that is training my counterparts so that they one day are as comfortable as I am with that.
You know, being a trainer, being a preceptor and a field training and officer, I always impress upon my students that I have, my interns, that one of the hardest parts of being a paramedic is doing this and standing back and saying, I need you to do a tube. I need you to start a line. I need you to give this med. I need you to do that particular procedure. It's really hard to be able to do that. You can train a monkey to start a line. You can train a monkey to do a crike. You can train a monkey to do an intubation. You can train them to do any number of things. Where it's really difficult is having the intellect to go, I need you to do that, and stand back and be able to watch that. It's really difficult. It's hard.
Utilizing the knowledge and everything around you, but just standing there and having to watch it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can do that better. Well, maybe you can. Yeah. But, you've got to give people a chance to do that stuff and that's where they grow. That's where...
Well, he touched on a super important point that, especially in emergency medicine, we have students all around us all the time. And if you're somebody that doesn't like to teach, you're kind of in the wrong business. Because even if you're not somebody that precepts paramedic students every month, like there's going to be EMT students walking around the ER. You're going to have an EMT student on your ambulance, probably whether you like it or not. We're going to have medical students floating through the ER. We have mid-level, I guess I shouldn't say mid-level, that pisses some people off. We have APP students, NP students, and PA students, in the ER all the time. And you've got to be willing to kind of step back and allow them to do these skills while you teach them. Like, it's so critical to do that in this field, or else the new people stand around not learning anything and just standing there with their hands in their pockets.
And then when the time comes for them to utilize that skill,
with no backup,
they
exactly
don't know how to do it.
Yep.
Or they could potentially not do it right.
Right.
Medicine is...
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say medicine is a team sport.
It is.
And every team member has a role to play. And sometimes it's going back to what you were saying about that patient, that the trauma patient, that no one was watching the monitor and didn't recognize the desaturation. Yeah. Sometimes it's something as simple as someone who's got that 10,000-foot view of the call
100%.
and is looking at things going, wait, we're missing this, or we're headed in that direction with the way things are looking, and why hasn't this been done yet? Because this is actually one of the not obvious but necessary next critical steps.
Well, in that example, like you said, everybody, when you're intubating this patient, you're all super focused in on your one task, but there's nobody that's stepping back and is like detached from the whole fray. Like emotionally, they're not involved. They're looking at the whole picture, and then they can look at the monitor and catch something like that, which I think is a key point.
Yeah,
and that's why I like the system here, because it doesn't matter who you are. You can step up and say, "Hey, look at this." I don't. Like, I've done this a few times looking at EKGs because I'm not very good at EKGs, but I know just enough to go, that doesn't look right. And so I can always say, hey, doc, you know what? I got a bad feeling about this patient. Maybe you better come look at him. Or, hey, Case, I decided to do this in the back of the ambulance. Look at it. And he may look at it and go, yeah, you just wasted some paper. Good job. Or it might be something that he goes, I better pull over the ambulance and let's switch spots.
And if you're like Nate and you're struggling with EKGs, check out my website, practicalems.com, for the most comprehensive, efficient EKG course around.
Well, that was a shameless plug. Holy cow.
I have tried and tried, even picked his brain over and over about stuff. And
don't be like Nate. Study my EKG course, practicalems.com.
Guess I'll get my credit card when we're done.
4 CME credits.
Yep.
I may take
that. But, back to the standardization of stuff, I really wish as our level, because I don't know what it is for like docs and PAs, whatever state you work in, but a few years back we were considering moving to Louisiana. And they did this really cool show on these one paramedics and EMTs in a certain town.
Acadia?
No.
Okay.
I don't.
Anyway,
It rhymed with Night Watch.
Oh.
And, I watched that show and I'm like, oh my God, these guys are awesome. So I started looking up some of the rules if we were going to move to Louisiana for the wife's job. And I went, I can't do anything in Louisiana. And it's the same in a lot of other states.
Yeah. Oklahoma.
Parts of Texas, even
South
Las
Dakota.
Vegas.
Well, it's funny.
I have a Wyoming license.
Yeah.
But I can't do what I can do in Wyoming that I can do here.
Yeah.
I really wish they would start looking at more standardization for EMTs and medics especially.
Yeah.
Because it's so different.
It is.
And I don't know who that needs to start with. I honestly don't.
I can answer that question.
Answer that question, Ken.
Unfortunately, it needs to start with Congress.
Oh.
Because as the current state of EMS in this country is, it is currently under the Department of Transportation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at the history of EMS, the true spirit of emergency medical services was because of a white paper that was published in the 60s about it was actually titled Accidental Death and Disability.
Right.
And it was focused on why people are dying on the nation's highways. And so the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration basically allocated the funds to create an EMS system. But they didn't stipulate how that was to be done, and they left a lot of things up to the states, which is one of the reasons why we have so many different approaches to how EMS is not only administered but practiced.
Man, how good would our patient care pre-hospital be if in every state we could do what you were trained to do?
But
I always wonder about that.
That's a double-edged sword, though.
Exactly.
Because what if Congress says, man, those paramedics and EMTs in Colorado, we need to put a thumb on those guys. Now let's make this standard here instead of where it is. I mean, we've worked hard to get it where it is.
And then you mentioned Texas. Texas is a somewhat unique setup because they have something called a true delegated practice where the EMS medical director for an organization credentials their out-of-hospital clinicians to do various things. And the state doesn't have a lot of control. I shouldn't phrase it that way. And let me add the disclaimer of I have never practiced in Texas, so I don't actually know how things work. And all I know is what I've read in my EMS textbooks that, so on and so forth. But the way that I understand it is a medical director in Texas can basically say, I want you to do this procedure. I want you to give this drug. And it is, you're operating quite literally under my license, which is not the case in a lot of states. You're operating under that physician's license to do those procedures, to administer those medications. And so it works in Texas just by the sheer way that their state laws are set up.
Yeah.
But then you also run into what we were talking about earlier about skill decay. And if you say all EMTs across the country have to be competent in this particular thing, whatever it happens to be. All paramedics have to be competent in this procedure, giving this medication, so on and so forth. And then you have those agencies where giving that med happens, say, once a year.
Yeah.
Doing that procedure happens, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. And you are expecting something of those individuals that they may not actually have the appropriate level of training or repetition to
That's true.
accomplish in a competent way. Not to say that they're not very skilled at what they do.
Yeah, you're right though, because it is hard to compare here where we do 8, 10, 12 calls a shift.
Urban
ERs are
setting, high
seeing
volume.
hundreds of patients. And you're right, in a rural town in Iowa with a primarily volunteer department or something, and I do understand that. I still just wish that EMS in general was a little more knowing of what we are capable of.
And it's not that they aren't. It's that the lawmakers have it set up that way. Yeah. And there's no standard way to, there's no standard law to kind of level the playing field, so to speak.
Well, I can tell you a nightmare scenario about standardization, actually, because I worked in Arizona, and when I worked there, over 20 years ago, 30 years ago, everything was standard. Literally, everything was standard. Do you remember the Plano 747 boxes, tackle boxes?
Yeah, where they all came out like a tackle box.
Right. So every apparatus in Arizona had one. Every one. They were all set up exactly the same. In theory, it's nice because I know that I could grab a box off of a fire truck in Apache Junction and open it up, and it would be just like my box. Mm-hmm. Or in Mesa, just like my box. In downtown Phoenix, whoops, that's just like mine. It's set up the same. Epi was here. Atropine was here. There were this, X amount of each drug in the proper spot. That happened in Phoenix. That happened in Mesa. That happened in Flagstaff. It happened in Apache Junction. It happened in Gila Bend. Didn't matter. Tucson. Didn't matter where you were at. And they were all standardized. Now, dear Lord, let's say, we needed to put something on. We were seeing patients where I worked in the East Mesa area, Apache Junction, East Mesa. We had so many patients that were there. We called them snowbirds. Well, we called them zards because they were like lizards, and they'd come out in the winter and sun themselves on the rocks. But they all came from either Canada or northern states, and they all had CHF, COPD. They all had some sort of bad comorbidity, and they always got sick. Always. And, dear Lord, if we needed some specific medication for that particular area that wasn't in that box, you know how hard it was to get that? And when they decided to do that after a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year study, they would put it on the box and it would go everywhere in the state. So that kind of standardization, well, on the surface looks great. You got to have some flexibility. And here, we used to have, it used to be similar to Texas. The physician advisor would say, I want you to do this, 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 and this. And there was a set acts allowed, which there still is. But we could go above and beyond that. But when the Board of Medical Examiners started to get involved, we had to start having waivers to do those things. Mm-hmm. And we do those things. We get waivers for certain things.
And we do have a lot of waivers
here. We do have a lot of waivers here. And
I mean, most of the stuff that I can do is waivered.
Yeah.
The problem with that process is it is tedious and somewhat prohibitive.
Yeah.
For things that shouldn't be that difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
And there was some momentum in changing that, and last I heard, that momentum has petered out, which is very unfortunate, because what we have now is a growing number of EMS fellowship trained and or board certified physicians that specifically have that knowledge base and understanding of how things work in the out of hospital setting, in such a way that they can facilitate moving the field forward, providing the level of care that our out-of-hospital clinicians are capable of for the specific populations that they are serving. And so, granted, we're not going to be able to fully standardize everything, nor should we, because exactly to Casey's point, you have that situation where in one region you are seeing a lot of a specific type of pathology, and you need to be able to treat it, and you're very good at treating it. But you go 200, 300, 400 miles away, and that's just not a thing there. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. Where I trained for residency, I saw probably 2-3 CHF patients a shift. And it was a very, very common thing, and I got very good at treating it. And when I first saw it, it was a very scary thing, but I had enough repetitions that it became almost second nature. Okay, I need BiPAP, I need nitroglycerin infusion, I need, I'm not going to give Lasix right away because the data shows that it's not great until you've done a little bit of resuscitation. And then I came here, and I see maybe 1 or 2 real bad CHF exacerbation patients a month. It's just not as common here because by sheer virtue of our geography, it kind of self-selects out. And so having those interventions, like for example, there are some places in this country that do nitroglycerin infusions in the field for CHF.
Oh.
And it's just not practical for us to do it here because A, we don't see it as much, and B, it would create a lot of waste, right?
Yeah.
Because
We're close.
carrying that medication, having to keep it up to, check the expiration dates, and the fact that it also, the right way to do a nitroglycerin infusion is with a pump, and you think about the cost for putting a pump on every ambulance, which there are some agencies, and I've had the pleasure of working with one of them, that have pumps on every single ambulance. And it is a fantastic resource because you are able to do a whole bunch more things like vasopressor medications for septic shock or things like that. But again, they're seeing those volumes. They're seeing those cases.
Yeah.
And without keeping up those skills, I don't know of a good way that we can say everyone has to be trained in doing X,
I mean,
Y, Z.
it would take a ton of education, continuing education through the whole year. I love that we can do so much. And I want my buddies who live in a different state to be able to do what I can do.
They should move here.
What's that?
They should move here.
Yeah. It's just, we have come so far just from when I started 15 years ago to what people are doing now on these ambulances and ERs and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing. And I'm just hoping that continues.